Alrighty, welcome everyone to Spark Teacher Training. Today is session number 2, or lesson number 2, session C, the third session for this week. And we are going to continue where we left off last week, or last session, with objects and object interactions. So today we're going to work on a project similar to this, where we're going to make kind of a basic matching game where you're going to take each of these items here and match them to one of these. This is obviously a very, very basic setup, but the point of the lesson is to teach you so that you can teach your students how to check if two things are matching, and then also how to do dragging and dropping so that you can move items around in the display and match them to different things. So if you wanted to do like a memory type of game, or a concentration type of game, or a grouping game where you need to make sure that they're grouping the correct objects together and those objects belong in the same categories, for example, then those situations will all be handled by what we're covering in today's lesson. So we're going to start off with just a blank scratch canvas like we do in every session. And to begin with, we're going to just erase the current object that's in here. Since our game that we're working on today doesn't actually have any kind of character or anything like that, any player, it's just the person using it, we're going to get rid of that. So we don't really need that. So let's right-click on the sprite number 1 down here and click delete, and that will give us a blank canvas that we can work on. So to start, we're going to add all of our objects first. Since we kind of know what the end result is going to look like, we have 3 objects, 3 areas, or 3 kind of targets to put them in, and then we've got a little X here that I set up, and I'll show you how to do this, but it's set up so that it randomly taunts the user with some messages saying, you know, hey, you can do better than this, or come on, what's taking you so long, that kind of sort of a thing. So let's start off by adding our different fruits or different objects. So it really doesn't matter what objects you use. I just picked some that are easily identifiable. And again, as mentioned in previous sessions, there are going to be a couple gotchas that I'm going to introduce on purpose so that you'll know certain situations kind of when they happen. And that way, when your students run into those situations, you'll kind of already be prepared for those. So my first step is just to drag this stuff into the correct area. The last one was an orange. We'll do a watermelon this time for this one. Okay. So we've got our 3 items. Now we're going to need to add kind of the target areas that you'll be able to drag these to using drag and drop, and they'll kind of snap to them. And again, we're going to do that the same way. I'm just going to use these buttons. I will leave one of these buttons green, but then I'm also going to duplicate it so that we have 3 target areas. Okay, we got apple, bananas, watermelon. I'm also going to rename these so I know what target they are. So this will be the apple target. This will be the banana target. And this third one will be the watermelon target. Okay, now we need to put in some kind of status so that people know if they've won the game or not, or if they've matched things correctly. So I'm going to add 2 more objects, one for a checkbox that pops up when they've successfully matched the items, and then a second one that's kind of like, nope, you're not doing it right. And I'm going to put them both kind of in this same area here. Okay, so right in the center of the stage, we've got the checkbox and the X button. Okay, so before we get into any of the programming, I just want to introduce some of the tools that you're going to use or that your students are going to use if they want to paint or make graphics in Scratch. So the first thing I'm going to do is take our Apple target here and click on costumes up in the middle. And this will basically give me the visual of what this object looks like. In Scratch and in most programming languages, the object itself is just kind of a invisible programming object, and then you have to assign a look to it, or you have to assign the way that that object looks. So in this case, we started off with all green buttons, but I want to show you some of the basics of how these tools down here work. So a few things that we have in our tools here. I mentioned yesterday or in the previous session that we have two different modes. We have a vector mode and a bitmap mode, which use this button here in the bottom right-hand corner. And as I mentioned yesterday, vector mode allows us to draw objects like lines and then move those objects around after the fact. Okay, and we kind of did that yesterday in our example. Well, today I'm going to show you bitmap mode. So we're going to leave all of these buttons in bitmap mode, and we're going to use the painting tools in bitmap mode. If you're not sure what mode you're in, you can look in the bottom right-hand corner here. It'll tell you bitmap mode, convert to vector. If you're in vector mode, it'll say vector mode, convert to bitmap. But the easiest way is really where the button placement is. Bitmap mode, the buttons show up on the left-hand side. Vector mode, the buttons will show up on the right-hand side. So that's a quick indicator of which mode you're in. So you should be able to tell if the buttons are on the left-hand side, you're kind of in that painting mode. If you're on the right-hand side, then you're in that vector mode. Oops, I look like I accidentally dragged something. Okay, so I'm going to take this object here and use the paint bucket tool. And we're going to change the color of this by using the paint bucket tool, but we're going to do something kind of unique. So first off, we're on the Apple target, so I'm going to use a red color, and I apologize in advance. I am actually red-green colorblind, so this causes issues for me sometimes, but you can fill in these items. And actually, I'm going to erase this because it looks like switching into vector mode messed it up a little bit. So let me just duplicate this again. Rename this one Apple target. You don't typically want to switch multiple times between vector and bitmap mode, just as an FYI. If you do, it has to actually convert objects to individual items and then the individual items back into objects. So in this case, we're going to use the paint bucket tool. And again, you can do this in either mode. In this case, I'm going to use the vector mode to start off so that I don't have to paint all these different shades. And then we'll convert to bitmap. So down in the bottom corner, when I choose the paint bucket tool, the paint bucket tool lets me paint in a solid color, but it also lets me do gradients, and you can see those gradients in the corner here. So I can do this really easily and just fill this in with red, fill the other one with yellow, and the last one in, we can leave green. But because the green one has this nice little gradient on it, we're going to make our own gradient. So we're going to start by choosing the red color, and then I'm going to choose this secondary color here. So we have a primary color and a secondary color. Usually the primary color is used as the fill color, and the secondary color is used for outlines on things. But since we're using the paint bucket tool, we're not going to have that option. It actually, these two colors set the gradient colors. So from white, or sorry, from red to white, or from red inside to white outside. So if I click on this secondary color, it'll switch between the two. And I can then change the color that I want to use. So I'm just going to use a slightly darker color, and then I can fill this in. Now, if I make this color really, really dark, you'll see the gradient a little bit more clearly. And one of the things that you'll see is that the center of the gradient actually moves around depending on where I want to click on it. Okay, so I actually want to flip these colors around so that it's lighter on the middle and darker on the outside edges. And I want to make sure that I'm using the rounded gradient instead of the left to right gradient or the top to bottom gradient. So if I choose the circular one, I can then click in the middle of the circle, and that'll make that the right color. And then I can switch my colors and click on the outside, and that'll give me kind of the outside edge of my gradient. And again, I can move that around depending on where I click. Just to match what I'm doing here, I'm going to choose the left-hand side, and then that'll match the green button. Oh, sorry, got my colors mixed up. The right-hand side. So then it matches our green button. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing on the banana button. So I can click on the banana button, take my yellow, make a slightly different shade of yellow, choose my gradient, flip them again, click in there, flip them around, and then click on the right-hand side. So now I've got a green button, a red button, and a yellow button, or a target, as we called them before. I can still move them around. But now, let's say I wanted to draw a little watermelon or a little apple or something in here, or just number them, something like that. We're going to switch to bitmap mode now for each of these, now that we've set our initial colors. Again, you don't want to flip back and forth all the time. So you'll want to do as much of your work as possible in vector mode before you switch to bitmap mode, because then you won't be able to adjust those individually. So if I switch to bitmap mode now, I can put in numbers or letters, or I can just use a paintbrush and actually paint something on here. So the paintbrush tools, they have a slider down at the bottom. So as you can tell, most of the tools will have an option in the bottom, and you can change the width of things, and then you can change the colors. And again, we have a primary and a secondary color. So I'm just going to change this to a 1 here. And again, I can use the text tool too. I'm using this to kind of just show how these tools work. I can click on the Apple target, switch it to bitmap mode, and then paint it 2. And then I can switch to my banana, convert to bitmap, and now I can paint a 3. Okay, so now we have a 1, 2, 3, green, red, yellow, and then apple, banana, and watermelon. Okay. So those paint tools, feel free to play around with them. You've got rectangle tools, line tools, circle tools. If you kind of hover your mouse over each of these, it'll give you modifier keys as well. So like on the rectangle tool, I can click to drag out a rectangle. Or if I don't want to click out the rectangle, I can hold the shift key and it'll always keep it as a perfect square. So this comes in handy if you want to use circles or squares, because you have those options. So again, ellipse, shift, circle. Text doesn't have any options. I don't think the rest of them have any options. But you have some cool tools that you can use that will help kind of make your artwork exactly the way that you want it. So now let's get to the actual programming. So we're going to start first by going into our object and making it so that we can drag and drop each of these items, the apple, the banana, and the watermelon. Okay, and we're going to start with the same way that we start every other project that we've done so far before. We're going to put in the when green flag is clicked. And I always like to start off thinking about how my program resets every time I hit the green flag. I always want the green flag to kind of reset things the way that they were before. And if people drag stuff over the next time I start my program, I don't want the items to start off where we drag them to. I always want them to jump back to their original positions. So I always like to use these blocks here under the events. When green flag is clicked, I always like to use the motion block that says go to a specific position, because then that moves our item into exactly the position that it started off with. So I'm going to really quick just go in here, add a green flag block for each one of these, and then move them to their current position. And again, if you've been following along with the tutorials as we've been going, the position updates automatically as you drag around. So whatever position it's currently in, the numbers in this block will update to that position. So we'll move the motion block into there. And so now, no matter where I drag these, when I hit the green flag, they reset to their initial positions, okay? So we always want to do that. Anytime you have a game that you can cycle through multiple times, you always want to create some kind of reset condition so that everything goes back to the way it was when the game started. This just makes it easy. It prevents mistakes and issues with the game. So I want to do that for each one. Now, we need to check. Obviously, people can drag stuff onto here, but we want it that if they're close enough, it's actually going to snap to the center of one of these circles, okay? And I mentioned this previously in one of the sessions, but Scratch and most programming languages by default typically will use the center of an object to determine different things like distances or locations or you know, coordinates, things like that. So these values that I'm seeing here are actually based on the exact center of the graphic, okay? So I need to make sure that either my centers are set correctly or that, as I just said we're going to do, we snap them to the center of the object. So the easiest way to do that is to use our control blocks and use a special sensing block. So we're going to start with our if condition, which is if something happens, then do this. And in this case, I like to just talk these through so that I know where my code is headed. But my condition is going to be something along the lines of, if I'm close enough to this, then snap it into place. So if I'm close enough to one of my targets, snap it to the center of that target, okay? And we have the ability to do that using sensing blocks, okay? So sensing blocks have the ability to check if something is touching, which is one of the ways that we can do this. We can check if it's touching that block. So for example, if I have this touching the watermelon target, then I want to have my block actually, or my object actually go to that block. So just like we used with the mouse cursor in our paint program and some of the other items, I want it to actually go to the watermelon target. So what this will do is if I'm touching this, it should snap to the center of the block, okay? And as we've mentioned in the past before, this will only do exactly what we tell it to do in the order we tell it to do when we tell this to do it, okay? So people sometimes set up their projects this way, and I've done this gotcha a few times, but I really want to drive the point home. If I drag this here and they're touching, okay, you would think that this block would fire if touching the watermelon target, then go to that watermelon target. It's definitely touching, not by much, but it's definitely touching. But it doesn't really happen because my green flag block moves the object to its original position and then checks to see if the watermelon target is checking. We only are checking this when the green flag is clicked. And when the green flag is clicked, that is not true. Our object is not touching our target when we click the green flag because we're moving it over. So we need to set something up so that it's always checking to see if it's touching. So again, I'm going to use one of these control blocks, in this case, the forever block, and I will we'll have an example in just a little bit where we actually use one of the other loop blocks, but in this case we're going to use the forever block. So now if I hit the green flag, it resets, but now you'll notice that this code block is highlighted in yellow. It's got like a little yellow glow around it. That means that this is still constantly running. So now if I drop this here, okay, it'll snap to a position. Okay, it's not the right position, but it is snapping to a position. And again, this is one of those gotchas. The reason that this isn't in the right position is because I intentionally, when I created this first block, moved the button so that it would be off center. Okay, so we have two ways that we can do this. Again, if you were following along with some of our previous lessons, we can use our move tools to move it into the appropriate space. But this is actually an easier option. For this case, we are always going to want it to snap to the center. We're never going to have a situation where we want it to move anywhere different. So Scratch has a tool in the upper right-hand corner here. There are some art tools where you can mirror things, flip them, left and right and up and down. And you can also set the center point of your costume. So if you look here, our center point right now is set to exactly where our item was snapping when it's touching. Okay, so I need to make sure that my center point is set correctly for this object or this costume for our first button. Okay, the way that I do that is I should just be able to click. Looks like I have my paintbrush selected, so let's try doing this. There we go. I need to click this, and then I can move this around so that it's at the center of my object. Okay, so if I click here, and again, because I moved this in the past, it doesn't seem like it would set it correctly, but all I have to do is click in the center, and now my object should be perfectly centered. And again, you can tell just by the way that our stage updated that it now snaps into the center position. Okay, I'm going to want to move my watermelon target so that it's in the right spot. And just as a point of explanation for the actual game, the players won't see these names, so they won't know what the targets are. Obviously, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a very simple game. They're just trying to match the colors to the right things. So we haven't done too much to set that up. But you could make a matching game that checks something completely different. Maybe you want to make a puzzle game where if two pieces are close together, you want to snap them together into the right spot. Or maybe you want to do one of those puzzle games where they have the geometric pieces that you have to snap them together to make a specific shape, but you can't see the shapes, you can only see the outline. Those types of things. All of those can be done using the same options. So if it's touching the watermelon target, then go to the watermelon target. Okay, so as long as I'm close enough and touching it, it'll snap to the middle. Okay. The other way that you can do this is with a slightly different sensing block, and I'm not going to do this particular one, but I want you to be aware that it exists. We can also use a sensing block called distance to, and the distance to will determine the distance from the center of one object to the center of another object. Okay, and the differentiator, and you can tell based on the shapes of these sensing blocks, but the differentiator here is this distance block is not a binary block. So this block, and what I mean by binary is that these gem-shaped blocks will always give you a true or false answer, a yes or no answer. So is it touching the watermelon or not? That's either true or it's not true. This one actually gives you a number. Okay, it's kind of a rounded shape. And so now we're going to talk about briefly, I'm just going to go on a slight segue, but operators. Operators are all of our math operations that we can do. And we'll touch on operators in a little bit when we handle these middle sections or these status symbols. But operators like this let you make calculations or check calculations. So in this case, if I wanted to check to see if my distance is less than a certain amount, and I'll use 50, just for the sake of example, but now I can check to see if the distance to my watermelon target is within a certain range, then go to that. So now if I press the green flag and everything resets, if I move this here, I don't actually have to be touching this, but I can get it pretty close. And again, it just depends on the values that you use. Okay, so I have to be somewhere close to the middle of the object. So just touching it is not enough. I actually have to be pretty close to it. And again, I can play with these values. So maybe I want it to be if it's within 100 pixels. The point is that it's from the center to the center. Okay, so if it's within 100, then it'll jump to the center. And I think the distances are actually calculated based on the graphics themselves. So even though the center to the center snaps together, the actual determination of whether or not the distance is within 100 pixels is based on how close in proximity they are. So this covers it. This does not. This, even though they're not touching, is close enough, it will snap in there. Okay, so we're not going to use that for this particular lesson or this particular game, but I just want to make sure that you know that you can also do distances and compare whether or not those distances are close enough together, because you may want to do certain items where you want to snap pieces together, or you want to make sure that an object is close enough to another object by distance rather than whether they're actually touching. So you can use those in all kinds of different ways. There's some cool things you can do with those also by combining different operators together. We also have special blocks that we'll talk about later in this lesson to do multiple conditions. So hang tight, we'll cover that. But for now, I just want to make sure that I have each one of these targets set up. So right now, my other two targets aren't set up. So I'm going to duplicate these blocks here and just set it up so that we're checking each target. So this is the watermelon target. If it's touching the apple target, I want it to snap to the apple target. And if it's touching the banana target, I want it to snap to the banana target. Okay, so now if I run my game, I should be able to snap these to any one of these as long as it's touching. Okay, and I want to repeat that same thing for all my other targets. So instead of clicking on each one and manually doing that, I can actually double click on this entire block here, right click on it, sorry, not double click, right click on it, duplicate it, and while it's being duplicated, as long as I don't click, I can drag this around and click on top of one of my other objects, and that will then snap to that object. Okay, I can also do that just for the forever block. So depending on where you click on that is where it will duplicate it. And then I can click that and click it into my watermelon. And now I can connect these to the existing one. So now, as long as I have this set up correctly, each object should snap to the middle of whatever item it's touching. And again, I did this just as a very simple example. I did it by color, but technically you can drag and drop multiple items onto each one. So we could have done this as like a category if we wanted to have 9 items and we have to sort them into the 3 categories based on color. We could do that. I'm just doing a very simple example. But we have our basic dragging and dropping now. I can drag this object and snap it to that section. Now, our next piece is to set up whether or not these are actually correct. Okay, we want to double check to see if our items are actually in the correct spot. And if they're in the correct spot, we want to show a checkbox. If they're not in the correct box or spot, we want to show an X. Okay, so the way that we're going to determine that, if you followed along yesterday, in the previous sessions for this week, we're going to create some variables. And variables are basically just a method that we use under the data tab here to keep track of things. Okay, it's a way that we keep track of things so that objects can communicate with each other in a way. Here to see if these two things are touching. Okay, and the touching object or the touching sense is a property of the apple and the button. These two things are touching. But our X and our checkbox have no way of knowing that these items are touching, or they don't have no idea of knowing whether they are touching or are not touching. So we need to give these items a way to know whether or not these are touching or not. Okay, and we did this in the Paint program a little bit with the mouse cursor and drawing, but we're going to set up variables here for each of these objects, and we're going to set them up so that our variables are basically checking if our match is correct. So I'm going to make a variable here for whether or not the apple is correct, whether the bananas are correct. I'll just call it banana correct. And then watermelon correct. Okay. And when you create variables, Scratch gives you these little blocks that we'll just kind of set up here in the middle at the top that tell you what the current status of is. And I'm going to, again, show you a gotcha here really quick. But this is basically keeping track of whether our apple is, or our apple, banana, and watermelon are in the correct spot. So for each of these objects, I want to start with the apple, and I'm going to say if the apple is touching the watermelon target, then I needed to go to the watermelon target, and I needed to set correct as 0. Okay. If the apple is touching the apple target, then I'm going to set apple target, or apple correct, I should say, to 1. And I can do whatever I want as far as the names here. I can use true or false. I can use 0 or 1. I can use red, green. As long as the match later on, it doesn't really matter what you type in. You can type in gobbledygook. I just like to use 0 and 1 as kind of my true and false because they're easier to type and there's less mistakes possible. But you can also use the words true and the words false. They are case sensitive, I believe, so you do have to match capitals with capitals. But so what this is going to do now, if I run my program, I'll see the apple correct. Oh, sorry. I'll see the apple correct variable update based on whether or not it's in the right spot. The apple, you'll see apple correct updates to 1. If I drag it one of the other spots, it does not update. Or I mean, it does update, but it gets reset back to 0 because that's not correct. And I need to do that same exact thing for all of these. So I'm going to click on my bananas now, and I'm going to set those same items. Again, we can duplicate these. We don't have to. Easier in some cases if you have a bunch of steps that you're doing to duplicate those. So if my banana is touching the watermelon target, that is not correct. If it's touching the apple target, that's not correct. And if it's touching the banana target, then banana correct should be 1. I'll do the same thing for okay, so now if I move each of these, they should set the correct match. One. Perfect. And I'm just checking to make sure that my variables are setting themselves correctly. All right. So here's the gotcha. If I put this in the right spot and update all my variables, okay, when I click the green flag the next time, and you'll see this again, I'm not going to fix this just yet. I'll fix it a little bit later. But you'll see that my variables, when I reset this, are still set to this, 1, 1, 1. Okay, they don't actually update until we drag it to the wrong spot. Okay, that's going to be an issue, and you'll see that issue later on when we set up our win-lose conditions. So let's move on to that, and then we'll fix the issue after we've set up our winning and losing conditions. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the checkbox and set up my win conditions. So just like with everything else, I'm going to set when the green flag is clicked. In this case, I don't want this checkbox to show unless we've correctly identified the different spaces. So the first thing I'm going to do, actually, we'll leave that because I want to show you a gotcha on that too. The first thing we're going to do instead is set up a check to see if all of our items are in the correct places. And so here's where we're going to use those operators again. So I'm going to start by checking, again, talking this through. I want to check to see if apple correct, banana correct, and watermelon correct are all set to 1. And as long as they're set to 1, or as long as they're not set to 1, I want to hide that green checkbox. Okay, so I'm going to use this loop here. It's called repeat until gem, or repeat until blank. And this basically does whatever steps are inside of here over and over and over again until some condition happens. Once that happens, it will stop doing this loop and move on to the next step. Okay, so I want this to hide my green checkbox as long as something is not true. Okay, and in this case, I'm checking to see if my apple, banana, and watermelon are in the correct spot. So the way that we do that with operators. And with operators, we're just going to check to see if apple correct is set to 1, or true, or whatever you chose for it. Whether banana correct is set to 1, and whether watermelon correct is set to 1. So I need all 3 of these conditions to be true for that to happen. Okay, so again, it's kind of might be a little bit confusing. I'm not waiting, I'm not doing this when these 3 are correct. I'm doing these steps until those 3 things are correct. So as long as they're not true, this loop is going to happen over and over and over again. So as long as these aren't in the right spot, it's going to hide this. Once it hides it, or sorry, once these conditions are true, that's when I want to show my checkbox. Okay, and the way that I can set these up, I only have room for 1 gem at a time. If I actually try to drag these into the other spot, then it will pop the other one out. So I need to use a special operator called the AND block. We have 3 special operators in here. And the special operators are AND, or not, and they're used to check multiple conditions. So I can check if apple is correct and watermelon is correct. Okay, but what if I want to check if 3 of these are true or correct? Okay, I can actually combine multiple AND blocks. So I can check to see if watermelon correct is 1, and apple correct is 1, and banana correct is 1. Okay, now the difference between the AND blocks or the OR blocks may or may not be obvious to you, but the basics is that the AND block, every condition has to be correct in order for this to come up as true. So as I said before, these gem blocks will always return a true or a false, a yes or a no. Okay, so AND blocks will only return true if all of those conditions are true. OR blocks will return true if one of those conditions are true. And I can combine these. So I can check to see if both of these are true, or if this one is true. So either of these, if banana correct is 1, this whole thing comes back as true. Or if both of these come back as true, watermelon and apple correct, then this will come back as true. It's both of these or just this one, or either of these. As long as one of these is true in an OR block, that will come back as true. Okay, in this case, we need to check to make sure that all 3 of them are in the right case. So we're not going to use the OR block. We want to use the AND block. All 3 of these need to be true in order for this to come back as a winning condition. We're not, the player hasn't won the game unless the apple's in the apple spot, the watermelon's in the watermelon spot, banana's in the banana spot. Okay, the last special block in the operators is a not block, and this just flips around whatever the condition is. So if this is true when all 3 of these happen, then putting it in a not block will make it not true. Okay, that's useful in certain conditions when you're making custom loops, but in this case we don't need the not block because this block is already a negative condition. This repeats until this condition is true. Okay, so if I start this, and two gotchas that I'm going to point out here now. One is if I click the green flag, okay, this is going to repeat until these are true. So let me stop this. And you'll kind of see our first gotcha right away. If I click the green flag now, I've hidden my checkbox, so it's disappeared off of this. And if I put these in the right spot, it should appear. Okay, it appears. It's underneath the black X, but it still counts. Okay, but here's where those two gotchas that I mentioned earlier come into play. If I click the green flag now, it resets all of my objects, but it doesn't reset my variables. Okay, so technically, just by starting this game, this section here is already true. We haven't even done anything, and it's already true. Okay. Additionally, even if I do reset my variables, so let's go in and do that, because that's the first issue, is that our variables don't update. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to set when the green flag is clicked for each of these, and it doesn't really matter where I do them. I'm going to put them in with each of the fruits just so that I know exactly where it is. But I can also set that on my stage if I want to here, so that they're all in one spot. I'm just going to set them for each item. So when the green flag is clicked, I want to set apple correct for my apple to 0. My banana is clicked. I want to set my banana is clicked to 0, or banana's correct, sorry. And then set watermelon correct to 0. Okay, again, I could have put those here on the stage. I could have added another green block and just put all three of them together. A lot of the times, if you have a complicated program, it's nice to put all your reset stuff in one spot. Sometimes that's possible, other times it's not. But in this case, I want to keep all my apple stuff together, all my watermelon stuff together, all my banana stuff together. So I'm just going to set these here. So now if I hit the green flag, all of these should set themselves to 0. Okay. And you'll notice that my checkbox here hit itself. And it shows up when we click that. Okay, it hides when it's not shown. And we're going to do a similar grouping for our X here. So again, there's more than one way to do this, but in this case, I'm basically going to duplicate this block here and put it on my checkbox. But we want to do the opposite. Instead of hiding it all the time, we want to show it, and we want to hide it when these conditions happen. So if we start our green flag here, our X is showing because they're not correct. Once we move everything into the right spots, these blocks of code happen. Okay, so it's repeating the show block until all three of these are true, and then it moves on to the next step. Once those are true, it hides the X and the checkbox shows. Okay, so we already have our basic game kind of working. Okay, now obviously we're kind of giving the answer away here by having these blocks here. So one of the things that I can do in Scratch is I have options for variables. I can show or hide the current state of that variable by clicking or checking and unchecking these boxes here. If I check them, it'll show it. If I uncheck it, it'll show it. And then the other thing I have the ability to do is I can change the way that that's actually displayed. So I have the ability to do a normal readout, a large readout that just shows the number, or a slider where you can manually change the numbers yourself. This will come in handy for most comp projects. I just be aware that they exist and that you hide these. So as you're making projects and students are making projects, it's just good to know that those things exist, because you can use them for like high scores or low scores, or the current score, things like that. So we have our basic game running now. When you match them up correctly, Okay, but here's another gotcha that we have. Gotcha is if I then take these now and move them around, okay, if I get them wrong, it doesn't update. Okay, and that's because we told this to repeat until that's correct. So once we solve our game and that's correct, it stops checking. It moved on to the next step and it doesn't check again. Okay. So one of the things that we can do is we can use a block down here called stop. This will actually stop our program, which is the same thing as hitting the red stop sign. So now, if we drag these around, that actually stops our program completely, which means we have to hit the green arrow, which resets everything in order to start our program over again. Okay. The last thing I want to do is, if you look at our sample program, our X is taunting the player until he gets the answer, or he or she gets the answer right. So we need to set up some messages for the little X. And Scratch has the ability to, under the looks tab, to say messages. And all that does is it will show a message for 2 seconds or however long until something happens. So we can put in whatever message we want. But you can do better than that. This loop will keep happening and it will keep saying you can do better than that over and over and over and over again. Okay. In this case, though, I would like for a random message to pop up. I'm going to give 3 choices, and I want a random message to pop up from those 3 choices based on whether or not that message pops up, okay? And I don't want it to just say that message all the time. I want it to only show that message randomly every, I don't know, 1 second, between 1 and 10 seconds, something like that. Okay, so we're going to set up a counter that counts the number of time that has elapsed, and we're going to randomly choose a timer amount. So I'm going to make a new variable and just call it timer. Call it text timer, just to make it clear exactly what it is. You may have multiple timers in projects, so it's good to name them accurately, just so that you know which timer you're using. So I like to be very specific with the names of my stuff. And I want to set, when the green flag is clicked, I want to set this text timer to a random number between 1 second and 60 seconds, or 6 seconds maybe. Now let's do 10 seconds. 1 second to 10 seconds, okay? So under my operators, and we use this in one of the previous projects, I want to be able to pick a random number. So if I drag that in there, it'll give me a random number between 1 and 10. So if I click on that, let's just make sure that every time I click the green flag, I am in fact getting a random number between 1 and 10. And again, I can see that value updating here. Okay. And then I want this timer to count down, and when it reaches 0, I want it to display this message, or one of our messages. So we'll start with one message and then do it so that we have multiple messages. The way to do that is I'm going to use a control block. And this is a first instance of a control block where we're going to have it use an if then else condition. So if something happens, then do that. But if not, then do something else. Okay. And basically what I want to check is if my timer equals 0. So if my text timer equals 0, if it's counted down all the way to 0, then I want it to say my message. Okay. If it hasn't counted down to 0, so if it's at 7 and it's not at 0, then I want it to subtract 1 from my timer. So I need it to change my timer by -1. Okay. Now, if I hit my green flag, one of the things that you'll notice is that pretty much every time this resets, our message pops up right away. And that's just because this is counting really, really quickly. So I'm going to change my random values to be from 60 to 600 because I believe that this goes in milliseconds. So 60 milliseconds should be 1 second and 600 should be 10 seconds. If not, it might just also be frames, but the point is that we want to actually see it counting down. And then once it counts down to 0, we want the message to show up. Okay. Now, we also want to reset the timer because right now we have it set, if the timer is 0, then say this. And this is repeating over and over until this condition is true. Okay, so I also need it to reset my text timer. So I'm going to take this exact same block that I have here and duplicate it. So now, again, if we follow our steps, Scratch will only do exactly what you tell it to do in the order you tell it to do it when you tell it to do it. So once my text timer reaches 0, I display this message for 2 seconds and then reset my random number. And again, you may want to play around with these numbers just to get a good mix of what random time frame you want it to go through. And that looks like that's working, right? So now we want to set up multiple messages. We want it to pick a random message from 3 messages that we set up in advance. Okay. And again, if you've been following along with some of our previous sessions, you may have already caught on to one of the methods that we can do it. As I mentioned, there's more than one way to do this. But what I'm going to do is set up a custom event or a broadcast or a message that we used in one of our previous sessions. So I'm just going to disconnect that really quick and stop my program so that it's not running in the background. But what I want to do is I want to set it up so that when this timer resets, it picks a random message. So I'm going to create a new variable called taunt message. And I'm not going to connect this just yet because I don't know exactly where I want this to go. But I do know that when my timer resets, okay, and actually we can probably put this in here. Set taunt message to a random number, and I'm going to pick 3 messages. I'm going to have 3 messages that pop up here. So I'm going to use between 1 and 3. And then once we pick the taunt message, I'm going to say, if my taunt message is 1, play this message. If it's 2, play a different message. So let's set up our messages first. And then if it's 3, set up a 3rd message. I'm going to change this one to say, hey, I don't have all day. Hurry up. And then I'm going to set the last one to, come on. There are only 3 options. This isn't that hard. Okay, and I can't just drag all of these into here, so I need to set up some conditions. So based on what taunt message actually pops up as, I'm going to use an if then else and say, if taunt message equals 1, then play my first message. Otherwise, play a different message. And I don't know which one that is yet because I haven't picked it yet. But we have 3 of these. So I could put this in here but then it's only checking between these two. I need to check it between 3 different messages. So I'm going to put another block inside of here, another if then else block, so that basically what the steps we're taking when we're done with this, it's going to be if the taunt message is 1, then say this one. Otherwise, if it's not 1, then I want to check if it's equal to 2. And if it is, then play my second message. Otherwise, if it's not my second message, then I know for sure that taunt message had to be 3. Because if it was 1, it would have triggered here. If it was 2, it would have triggered here. If it's 3, then that's the only other option. Okay. And again, we have our status here for taunt message, so we can see in advance which was the last message to play, and then we'll see it update when it gets to this section. Again, counting down, once it hits 0, it'll pick a new number, and then it'll play our message. Now, the reason I set this up this way is because some people may think that because the taunt message here is set to 1, that the first message will display. But you have to remember that we're not setting taunt message until here. We're picking our random number here just before. So again, it'll only do it in the order that you tell it to when you tell it to do it. Okay. Now, another thing that I might want to do just to kind of make this a little bit easier to read, once your programs start to get complicated, you kind of want to separate out things that happen in the program. And for that, we have something called custom blocks, or people call these functions sometimes. And you can make your own blocks that say pick message, for example. Okay. And what that does is that gives you a block here that's almost like an event, but now I get a special block here that I can just drag that into this section. Okay, it makes it a lot easier to run your programs when you can split it up into these smaller functions. So whenever possible, you yourself, and you'll want your students to do the same, you'll want to break your program into smaller sections. And the way that we do that is with these custom blocks. So I can move all of my programs into these custom blocks and then have those run in specific sections. It just makes it really easy to tell when you're troubleshooting and debugging where the issue is in your program, because now you've chunked up your program into smaller sections and you can individually test those sections to see where the error or where the issue is actually coming up. Okay? So that basically gives us the program. I do want to hide my messages, but now we should have everything set up correctly to where this green block happens. Okay. For homework or for the next section, I would like for you to check, instead of this stop all block, I would like you to make a custom function, just like I did here, with pick message, called reset. And what I want you to do is to create this function called reset, and when somebody solves this correctly, I want it to call the reset function and move the apple, the watermelon, and the banana back to the beginning, so somebody can play this as many times as they want to. If you want to get crazy, you can also extend this program so that these colors reset in different positions randomly. And then there's also, other extensions that you can make. You can add a score so that the person has to solve it. You can add a timer, a separate timer, so that the person has to solve whatever puzzle it is within a certain period of time. I'll leave that up to you how far you want to extend it. But for our session next week, for our next session, I want you to figure out how to create a reset. Okay, I'll give you a hint. these custom functions that we have set up will chunk that section out, but that's not the only thing that you'll need in order to do that. Okay, you will have to create a custom event, or you will have to do it based on some kind of event. So check back on the videos from earlier this week to see how to set up those custom events, and then see if you can figure out how to do it. Our next session, we have some special guests that will be joining us from the Lemelson Center, the Smithsonian Lemelson Center for Invention and Innovation, and also from Arizona State University's Fulton Schools of Engineering. So we'll be talking next week about invention, and kind of the theme of our event. We're not going to give you the specific theme, but we are going to give you kind of a general concept that you might want to get your students ready for. And then we're also going to talk about design. So how to make your apps or your games designed in a way that makes them easy to understand for people and easy to pick up without having to have instructions. There are some really cool things that we'll talk about next week with our friends from the Smithsonian Lemelson Center for Invention and Innovation and ASU's Fulton Schools of Engineering. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, as usual, feel free to email me, leave a message or a comment on our YouTube channel for this video. We'll update the teacher training page with the correct address here, sparkappleague.com/teacher-training. So we'll post the YouTube link on there so you can leave comments. You can also email me, fill out the form contact page, go in our channel. We have tons of different ways you can get in touch with us if you have questions or if you get stuck. So I hope to see you guys next week. Thanks for watching our video, and if you didn't get a chance to join our Hangout to actually make this an interactive session, please do that for some of the next sessions, or just watch the video live on YouTube and ask your questions there as we're going. Our next session will also be at 12, and the current schedule is always at this page here, sparkappleague.com/teacher-training. So be sure to visit that page for updates. All right, I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching this video, and I can't wait for our upcoming competition. Take care.